Every day, Michael Sullivan played for nothing more than scraps and memories, never imagining that the stranger who listened in the dark would uncover the truth behind his song. He sat at the piano like it was the only thing keeping him alive, fingers cracked by winter, eyes lost to years. Every night, under the harsh glow of a city streetlight, Michael Sullivan's fingers danced across chipped piano keys, the sound trembling through the cold. Once a decorated soldier, now a man forgotten by the world. "Why do you keep playing the same song?" someone once asked. "Because it's the only way my son might find me," he whispered. He didn't know that somewhere out there, someone was listening, and that his melody, born of loss and love, was about to echo far beyond the streets. This is the story of how a homeless veteran's song, written for one lost boy, found its way home and changed both their lives forever. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. He played for a ghost, a memory of a little boy who was now long gone. Every night, Michael Sullivan sat at the same public piano, his worn fingers playing the same quiet lullaby. He never knew if the song would ever reach the one person it was meant for. The cold was a living thing on this corner. It seeped through the thin fabric of Michael's worn-out army jacket, a jacket that had once been a symbol of pride and now served as his last shield against the world. The November wind howled between the tall buildings of downtown, carrying with it the smell of exhaust fumes and damp pavement. People hurried past, their faces buried in scarves, their shoulders hunched against the biting air, oblivious to the man who had become a fixture on their path. Michael, or Mike as he preferred, sat on the hard, cold bench of the public piano. The instrument itself was a sad sight. Its black paint was chipped and peeling, revealing the pale wood beneath. Cigarette burns dotted its surface like forgotten constellations, and a few of the keys were yellowed and cracked like old teeth. To most, it was just a piece of street furniture, a novelty left to decay. To Mike, it was a sanctuary. It was the only thing in his life that still made sense. For over 10 years, the streets had been his home. He knew the rhythm of the city by heart. The early morning rumble of delivery trucks, the midday rush of office workers, the late-night wail of sirens. He knew which grates pushed up the warmest air and which alleys offered the best protection from the rain. He had learned to make himself invisible, to fold into the background of a world that had no place for him. He was a man in his late 50s, but the harshness of his life had carved decades more onto his face. His beard was a grizzled gray, his hands were calloused and scarred, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a deep, settled sorrow that rarely wavered. He took off his fingerless gloves, tucking them into the pocket of his jacket. The cold immediately bit into his knuckles. He flexed his fingers slowly, a ritual he performed every night to coax the stiffness from his joints. His breath plumed in the air, a fleeting white cloud. He placed his hands on the keys, the worn ivory cool beneath his touch. For a moment, he just sat there, gathering himself. He closed his eyes, shutting out the hurried world around him. He wasn't playing for them. He wasn't playing for the few coins that might land in the empty coffee cup at his feet. He was playing for someone who wasn't there. Then, the music began. It wasn't a grand concert piece. It wasn't a lively tune meant to draw a crowd. It was a lullaby. Simple, soft, and heartbreakingly gentle. The melody drifted into the cold night air, a thread of warmth in the freezing dark. Each note was precise, deliberate. He knew this song better than he knew his own name. He had carried it in his heart for 20 years, a precious, fragile thing that had survived a war, survived the loss of his wife, survived the descent into addiction and loneliness. As he played, the gray city corner melted away. He was somewhere else entirely. He was in a small, sunlit nursery, the walls painted a cheerful yellow. A wooden crib stood in the corner. His wife, Carol, was there, her smile as bright as the sunshine pouring through the window. Her laughter was the sweetest sound he had ever known. And in the crib was his son, Ethan, a tiny, perfect child with a tuft of brown hair and eyes that held all the wonder in the world. Mike would stand over the crib, his large, soldier's hands feeling clumsy and out of place. He would hum this very tune, his deep voice a soft rumble. Ethan's fussy cries would quiet, his little body would relax, and his eyes would slowly drift shut. Carol would lean her head on his shoulder, her hand resting on his arm. "You're a natural, you know," she would whisper. In those moments, he had felt like the luckiest man alive. He had a home. He had a family. He had a future. A car horn blared, shattering the memory. Mike's eyes snapped open. He was back on the cold sidewalk. The yellow nursery was gone. Carol was gone. Ethan was gone. All that remained was the hollow ache in his chest, an emptiness that the years had never filled. He kept playing, his fingers moving on their own, channeling the pain into the melody. The lullaby was all he had left of them. It was a promise he had made to his son, a promise to always be there, even when he couldn't. A businessman in a tailored overcoat, Mr. Henderson, strode past, his expensive shoes clicking on the pavement. He was talking loudly into his phone, his voice sharp and impatient. "No, I don't care what their offer is. We're not budging," he said. He shot a sideways glance at Mike, his face twisting into a mask of annoyance. The soft piano music was an unwelcome intrusion into his world of deals and deadlines. He shook his head in disgust and walked on, his voice fading into the city's hum. Mike didn't flinch. He was used to the looks, the muttered comments, the casual cruelty of people who saw him not as a person, but as a problem. He had once been a man people respected. Sergeant Michael Sullivan, a decorated veteran who had led his men with courage and honor. Now he was just another homeless man, a ghost haunting the edges of society. The fall had been long and brutal. After Carol died in the car accident, the light had gone out of his world. The grief was a monster that consumed him whole. He had turned to pills, then to the bottle, trying to numb a pain that was too deep to heal. He lost his job. He lost his house. And in the fog of his despair, he lost his son. Ethan had been sent to live with Carol's sister in another state. At the time, Mike had told himself it was for the best. He was no good for the boy. He was a wreck, a danger to himself and everyone around him. He had promised to get clean, to come back for him. But shame was a powerful poison. The longer he stayed away, the harder it was to return. The years slipped by, turning from months into a decade. Now, Ethan would be a grown man. Would he even remember his father? Or would he only remember the broken man who had let him go? "I've always loved him," Mike whispered to the empty street, his voice a rough, broken thing. The words were carried away by the wind. "Not a day goes by I don't think about him. He's my boy. I just hope he finds me one day." He finished the song, the last note hanging in the air like a question mark. He let his hands fall from the keys, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the noise of the city. He looked into his coffee cup. A few quarters and a dime. Enough for a hot drink, maybe. Not enough to silence the hunger gnawing at his stomach. He sighed, a weary, defeated sound. The hope that had once flickered inside him had dwindled to a tiny, stubborn ember. Some nights, he wondered why he even bothered. Why he kept coming back to this cold corner, playing a song for a boy who would never hear it. Across the street, the lights of a small cafe called The Daily Grind cast a warm, inviting glow. A young woman was inside, wiping down the counter. Her name was Jessica. She had taken over the cafe from her parents a year ago. She was often there late, long after the last customers had gone home. From her window, she had a clear view of the public piano. Every night, she saw the sad, bearded man sit down and play. She didn't know his name or his story, but she could hear the sorrow in his music. It was a melody that spoke of loss, of a love that still lingered. Tonight, the cold seemed particularly harsh. She watched him shiver, his shoulders hunched deep into his jacket. She saw the emptiness of his cup. On an impulse, she poured hot coffee into a sturdy paper cup, grabbed a freshly baked muffin, and put them in a small bag. She put on her coat, locked the door behind her, and crossed the street. The traffic light bathed them in alternating red and green light. Mike didn't notice her approaching until she was standing right in front of him. He looked up, his eyes wary. People who approached him usually wanted something, for him to leave, to stop playing, to simply disappear. Jessica offered a small, hesitant smile. "Hi," she said softly. "I see you out here every night." I thought, "Well, it's freezing." She held out the bag and the coffee. "This is for you." Mike stared at her, his expression unreadable. He looked at the warm offerings, then back at her face. He hadn't been shown this kind of direct, unsolicited kindness in a long time. It felt foreign, like a language he had forgotten how to speak. You don't have to do that," he said, his voice raspy. "I know," Jessica replied. "But I wanted to. Please, take it." Slowly, As if afraid it might vanish, he reached out and took the bag and the cup. The warmth of the coffee seeped through the paper, a small comfort against his frozen fingers. He looked down at the muffin, then back up at her. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you, miss." "It's Jessica," she said. "And you're welcome." She lingered for a moment, unsure of what else to say. "That song you play, it's beautiful." A flicker of something, pride, maybe, or just surprise, passed through Mike's eyes. "It's just an old lullaby," he mumbled, looking away. "Well, I like it," she said. She gave him another small smile, then turned to go. "Stay warm." Mike watched her cross the street and disappear back into the warm glow of her cafe. He held the coffee cup with both hands, letting the heat thaw his fingers. He took a sip. It was hot and strong, and it felt like a miracle. He opened the bag and took out the muffin. It was still warm from the oven. He ate it slowly, savoring every bite. It was the best thing he had tasted in months. It wasn't just the food or the coffee. It was the gesture. For a few minutes, he had been seen. Someone had looked at him and seen a person, not a nuisance. It was a small thing, but on a night this cold, a small thing could feel like everything. The ember of hope inside him glowed a little brighter. He placed his hands back on the piano keys and began to play again. This time, the lullaby sounded a little less like a lament and a little more like a prayer that might just be answered. The next few nights followed a similar pattern. The weather grew colder, a damp chill that settled deep in the bones. The crowds on the street thinned out earlier, people eager to get home to their warmth and comfort. But Mike was always there at his piano, and Jessica was always there in her cafe. Each night, just before she closed up, she would bring him a coffee and something to eat, a sandwich, a bowl of soup, a pastry. They developed a quiet routine. She would hand him the food, and they would talk for a few minutes. Their conversations were never deep. She never asked him how he had ended up on the streets. He never volunteered the information. They talked about the weather, about the city, about the funny-looking dog a woman walked past every evening. It was a fragile, unspoken agreement. She offered him a moment of connection without judgment, and he accepted it with a quiet, dignified gratitude. "Slow night," she said one evening, gesturing back at her empty cafe. Mike nodded, taking a sip of the hot soup she had brought him. "People don't want to be out in this." "Can't blame them," she said, pulling her coat tighter. "You must be freezing." "I'm used to it," he said. It was true. His body had acclimated to the constant cold, to the point where real warmth felt strange and almost suffocating. "Do you ever think about going somewhere else?" she asked gently, her gaze soft. "A shelter or something?" Mike looked down at his hands. He had tried the shelters, back in the beginning. The noise, the crowds, the constant fear of having his few possessions stolen. The hollow-eyed despair of the other men had been a mirror he couldn't bear to look into. Out here, on his corner, he was alone. But it was a loneliness he could control. "The piano's here," he said simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. This piano was his anchor. It was his purpose. Jessica seemed to understand. She didn't push. "Well," she said, "the offer for a warm place to sit is always open if you change your mind. I'm here until at least 10. "Thank you, Jessica," he said, and he meant it. One night, as he was playing, a group of college students stopped. They were loud and cheerful, their faces flushed from the cold and from drinking. One of them, a young man with a smartphone, started recording him. "Dude, this is awesome," he said to his friends. "It's like so raw and emotional." Mike tensed, his fingers faltering on the keys. He hated being recorded. He felt like an exhibit in a zoo, a piece of tragic street art for people to consume and share. He kept his head down, hoping they would lose interest and leave. "What's the song, man?" another one asked. Mike didn't answer. He just kept playing, his focus narrowed to the keys beneath his fingers. He poured all his discomfort, all his frustration, into the music. The lullaby took on a deeper, more melancholic tone. The student with the phone, whose name was Ben, didn't seem to notice Mike's distress. He was captivated by the scene. The old, broken-down man, the worn-out piano, the sad, beautiful music against the backdrop of the bustling city. It was perfect. He recorded about a minute of the song. Then his friends dragged him away toward a nearby bar. "Let's go, man. We're gonna miss happy hour." Later that night, sitting in the loud, crowded bar, Ben looked at the video he had taken. The audio was surprisingly clear. The haunting melody of the lullaby cut through the noise of the bar. He felt a pang of something, pity, or maybe something more. He wondered about the man's story. On a whim, he decided to post the video online. He uploaded it to his social media page with a simple caption. This homeless man plays the same beautiful song every night on a public piano in downtown. I wonder who he's playing it for. He didn't think much of it. He figured a few of his friends would see it, maybe leave a comment, and that would be it. He ordered another drink and forgot all about it. He had no idea that he had just lit a fuse. At first, the video was just a drop in the vast ocean of the internet. A few of Ben's friends liked it. One of them shared it. Then one of their friends shared it. The video started to spread, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. There was something about the clip that resonated with people. It was the raw authenticity of it. The man wasn't performing for the camera. He was lost in his own world, playing a song that clearly meant everything to him. The caption, "I wonder who he's playing it for," sparked a fire of speculation. The comments section exploded. "That's a lullaby," one user wrote. "My grandmother used to sing that to me. He must be playing for a child." Another commented, "You can see the pain in his face. This is a man with a broken heart. God bless him. Does anyone know where this is? I want to go find him and give him some money." The video was shared on larger pages, picked up by local news aggregators, and then by national ones. The view count climbed from a few hundred to a few thousand, then to tens of thousands, and then into the hundreds of thousands. People from all over the country were watching the nameless, homeless man play his song. They shared their own stories of loss and love. They debated his backstory. They marveled at the power of his simple melody. The video went viral. Mike, of course, knew nothing about any of this. His world remained confined to a few city blocks. He had no phone, no access to the internet. He only knew that something had changed. More people were stopping at his corner now. They didn't just hurry past. They stood and listened, their expressions thoughtful and compassionate. The number of coins and bills in his coffee cup grew. One day, someone left a thick, warm blanket folded on the piano bench. Another day, a bag of groceries appeared. He was grateful, but also deeply unnerved. The attention made him uncomfortable. He was used to being invisible. Now he felt exposed, the focus of a spotlight he had never asked for. People tried to talk to him, to ask him about the song. "Is that for your son?" a woman asked one afternoon, her eyes filled with sympathy. Mike's head snapped up. How could she know? He just stared at her, his throat tight, unable to form words. He gave a short, jerky nod, then quickly looked away, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman smiled sadly, dropped a $20 bill in his cup, and walked away. The interaction left him shaken. He felt as though a stranger had just read a page from his most private diary. He packed up his few belongings earlier than usual that day, retreating to the quiet solitude of the alley he called home. He didn't understand what was happening. It felt as if the world had suddenly decided to pay attention to him, and he wasn't sure he could bear the weight of its gaze. Jessica saw it too. She saw the bigger crowds, the people taking pictures with their phones from a distance. One of her regular customers showed her the video. "Hey Jess, isn't this the guy who plays outside your place?" She watched the clip, her heart sinking a little. She recognized the student, Ben, who sometimes came in for coffee. She understood his intentions were probably good, but she worried about Mike. She had seen the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. This viral fame felt like a violation of that. It turned his private grief into public entertainment. That evening, when she brought him his soup, she found him looking more withdrawn than ever. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "There are a lot of people stopping by lately." Mike shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "They're just curious. Someone showed me a video online," she said softly. "Of you playing. It's everywhere." He finally looked at her, his eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and confusion. "A video? A young man recorded you the other night. I don't think he meant any harm. People are moved by your music, Mike." He looked down at the piano keys, his expression unreadable. "It's not for them," he whispered. "It was never for them." He felt a growing sense of panic. His corner, his sanctuary, was no longer safe. The world was closing in, and he didn't know where to run. For the first time in a long time, he thought about leaving, about finding another corner in another city where he could be invisible again. The thought of starting over was exhausting, but the thought of staying here, under the constant watch of strangers, was becoming unbearable. The night felt darker, the wind colder. He felt the crushing weight of his loneliness more acutely than ever before. He was on the edge of giving up. For 2 days, the piano bench on the corner sat empty. The silence it left behind was a heavy, unnatural thing. The usual city noise seemed louder, harsher, without the soft melody to temper it. The wind swept across the bare keys, creating a dissonant, lonely sound. People who had grown accustomed to the nightly concert now walked past with a sense of disappointment, their gazes lingering on the abandoned instrument. The corner felt like a stage after the actor has gone home, leaving only a ghost of a performance behind. Jessica watched from the window of the daily grind, a worried knot tightening in her stomach. She had come to expect him, to rely on the quiet ritual of their brief nightly conversations. His absence felt personal. Had her words scared him off? Had the sudden, intrusive fame driven him away for good? Each time the door to her cafe opened, she looked up with a small, irrational hope that it would be him, seeking the warmth she had offered. But it never was. The internet, however, did not forget so easily. The question, "Where is the piano man?" became a new trending topic. The comment sections of the original video filled with worried speculation. "I hope he's okay. It's getting so cold out. Maybe someone recognized him and took him in. More likely the city ran him off. They hate the homeless." The story had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer about a man playing a song. It was a mystery, and mysteries attracted reporters. On the 3rd day of Michael's absence, a white news van with a large Channel 8 News logo on its side pulled up to the curb. A woman in a sharp, practical trench coat stepped out, followed by a tired-looking cameraman. Her name was Brenda Vance. She had the brisk, no-nonsense air of someone who saw stories not as human events, but as deadlines to be met and ratings to be won. She saw the viral video as her ticket to a bigger market, a heartstring-pulling piece that could go national. She marched directly into the daily grind, the small bell on the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that was at odds with her demeanor. Jessica was wiping down the espresso machine, and she looked up, her face a polite but weary mask. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Brenda Vance, Channel 8 News," the woman said, flashing a press badge. "I'm doing a story on the pianist who plays out here. The viral sensation. You run this place?" "I do," Jessica said, her grip tightening on her cleaning cloth. She immediately felt a wave of protectiveness for the man whose name she barely knew. "Great," Brenda said, her eyes scanning the cafe as if looking for the best angle. "People are saying you've been kind to him, bringing him food, talking to him. Can you tell me anything about him? His name? His story? Why he disappeared?" Jessica chose her words carefully. "He's a quiet man who plays the piano. And he's not a viral sensation. He's a person. I think people should respect his privacy." Brenda gave a thin, dismissive smile. "Respectfully, miss, his privacy ended when he was viewed by 3 million people. This is a human interest story. People want to help. We can't do that if we don't know who he is." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Did he ever mention a family? A child, maybe? The song he plays is a lullaby. That's the angle we're going with." The cold, clinical way she talked about his pain made Jessica's blood run cold. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice low but firm. Brenda's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me. You're not interested in helping him. You're interested in using him. He's not a story for you to package. He's a man who has lost everything. If he wanted the world to know his name, he would have told them." For a moment, Brenda looked genuinely taken aback. Then her professional mask snapped back into place. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "Have it your way." She turned and marched out of the cafe, her cameraman trailing behind her like a shadow. Jessica watched them go, her heart pounding. She had protected his secret, but she knew this was far from over. Brenda Vance was not the type to give up easily. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Michael was huddled in a different alley, one narrower and darker than his usual spot. He had retreated, pulling the shell of his anonymity back around him. He felt like a soldier pinned down by enemy fire. The world's attention was the enemy, and he had no defense against it. He was cold, and his stomach ached with a familiar, gnawing hunger. He had the money people had given him, a small wad of bills tucked deep in his pocket, but he was afraid to spend it. Afraid to be seen, to be recognized. He leaned his head back against the cold, damp brick of the alley wall. He closed his eyes and let the memories come. He was a young man again, standing straight and tall in his army dress uniform. Carol was on his arm, her eyes shining with pride. He remembered the feel of the hot desert sun in a foreign land, the weight of his rifle, the camaraderie of the men by his side. He had been someone then. He had had a purpose. He had been brave. Where had that man gone? He had survived enemy patrols and firefights, had come home with a chest full of medals, only to be defeated by a quiet, empty house. He had been a hero to his country, but he couldn't even be a father to his own son. The shame of it was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had run from his grief, run from his responsibilities, and he had been running ever since. This sudden fame felt like a judgment. The world was finally looking at him, and he was sure they could all see what a failure he had become. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet suburban town, a young man named Ethan was scrolling through his phone. He was 28 years old, a carpenter with calloused hands and a steady, quiet nature. He had a small apartment, a good job, and a life he had built for himself from the ground up. He had few memories of his father, only fragmented images, a deep, rumbling laugh, the scratchy feel of a beard, the sound of a soft, simple melody hummed over his crib. His aunt and uncle, who had raised him, had been kind but sad. They told him his father had been a good man, a war hero, but that he had gotten sick with grief after his mother died. They said he had disappeared, that they didn't know if he was alive or dead. Ethan had made his peace with it, or so he thought. He had buried the ghost of his father deep inside him. A message popped up on his phone from a friend. It was a link to a news article. The message read, "Hey man, this is probably crazy, but doesn't this guy kind of look like that old photo of your dad?" Ethan's thumb hovered over the link. He felt a strange sense of dread. He clicked it. The article was titled, "Mystery of the Viral Piano Man. Who is the homeless veteran who has captured the nation's heart?" There was a photo, a still from the video. It was a man with a gray, unkempt beard and sorrowful eyes, sitting at a piano. The face was older, weathered, and broken, but the structure of it, the jawline, the shape of the nose, the pale blue eyes, was achingly familiar. It was the face from the photograph on his aunt's mantelpiece. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He clicked the embedded video. The scene was dark, the quality grainy. But then the music started. The lullaby. It was the one clear, perfect memory he had. The melody cut through the years, through the walls he had built around his heart. It was like hearing a voice he thought he had forgotten. He listened, his body frozen, his mind reeling. The camera zoomed in on the man's face, and Ethan could see the raw, unguarded pain in his father's eyes as he played. He wasn't playing for the crowd. He wasn't playing for the camera. He was playing for him. A storm of emotions crashed over him. 20 years of anger, of feeling abandoned. 20 years of grief for a father he thought was lost forever. 20 years of a dull, persistent ache of wondering why. It all rose to the surface at once. He saw the worn-out army jacket his father was wearing, and a fresh wave of shame and pity washed over him. This was not just his father. This was a veteran, a man who had served his country, now living on the streets. He closed the article, his hands shaking. He stood up and paced his small living room, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? This man, his father, was out there. He was alive. He was playing their song. Was this a cry for help? A plea for forgiveness? Or was it just the sad, repetitive ritual of a broken man? He didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't close the tab and go on with his life as if he hadn't seen it. The ghost he had buried was back, and this time, it was playing the piano. Back in the city, the cold and hunger finally drove Michael from his hiding place. He knew he couldn't stay in the alley forever. He needed to eat. More than that, he needed the piano. It was a compulsion, a deep, primal need. Playing the lullaby was the only thing that made him feel real, the only way he knew how to talk to his son across the vast, silent distance of the years. He told himself he would just play one song, for himself, and then disappear again. He made his way back to his corner as dusk was falling. He hoped the cover of Near Darkness would shield him. He was wrong. The viral video had turned his corner into a landmark. A small group of people were already there, waiting, and standing among them, holding a microphone like a weapon, was Brenda Vance. Her cameraman was with her, the lens of the camera like a single, unblinking eye. As soon as they saw him, a murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's face lit up with a predatory triumph. She strode toward him, the cameraman scrambling to keep up. "There he is," she announced, her voice unnecessarily loud. She shoved the microphone in his face. "Sir, Brenda Vance, Channel 8 News. The whole country wants to know your story. Is it true you're Sergeant Michael Sullivan? Is it true you were awarded the Silver Star for valor?" Michael froze, caught in the glare of the camera's light. The questions were like body blows, knocking the air from his lungs. How did she know his name? His rank? He felt stripped bare, his past exposed for all to see. "People are calling you a hero," Brenda pressed on, relentless. "But you're living on the streets. Why? What happened?" She softened her voice, a practiced, insincere sympathy. "We heard you might be playing for a son you lost touch with. Is that true? Are you trying to find him?" Michael couldn't speak. His throat was closed. His mind was a roaring chaos. He looked past her, at the faces in the small crowd. They were all staring at him, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He felt like a freak on display. This was his worst nightmare realized. His private grief, the sacred memory of his son, was being turned into a cheap television spectacle. He pushed past her without a word and sat down at the piano. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely find the keys. He had to play. It was the only answer he had. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the camera, the reporter, the staring faces. He tried to find the quiet place in his memory, the yellow nursery, Carol's smile, Ethan's sleeping face. He began to play. The notes were hesitant at first, trembling and uncertain. The lullaby sounded fragile, broken. He could hear Brenda providing a hushed, dramatic voiceover for her camera. And here it is, the beautiful, haunting melody that has touched millions. A father's song for his lost son, a song of hope and despair played out on the cold city streets. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, fighting back a wave of nausea. She was twisting it, cheapening it, turning his heart's purest expression into a cliché. The anger and despair rose in him, and he poured it all into the music. The lullaby grew stronger, louder, a cry of defiance against the world that was trying to devour him. He finished the song, the final chord echoing in the cold night. He didn't wait for a reaction. He stood up abruptly, the bench scraping on the sidewalk. He looked directly into the camera lens, his pale blue eyes blazing with a fire no one had seen before. It was the look of a cornered animal, of a soldier about to make his last stand. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of a nearby alley, leaving Brenda Vance with her story, the crowd with their spectacle, and the piano sitting alone under the streetlight. As he walked, a single, cold thought solidified in his mind. It was over. He couldn't do this anymore. He had to leave this city, this life. He had to give up. The song had failed. His son was never coming back. This night, the night the world found him, was the night he finally and truly lost all hope. The alley was a black, jagged wound in the side of the city. Michael plunged into it, his footsteps echoing off the grimy brick walls. He didn't stop until he was deep inside, where the sounds of the street were muffled and the only light was a faint, hazy glow from the city sky above. He slid down the wall, his legs giving out, and sat on the cold, trash-strewn ground. The adrenaline from the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. It was a silent, tearless breakdown, the kind of despair that was too deep for tears. He had thought he had hit rock bottom years ago, but he realized now that there were always new depths to fall to. To be seen, to be known, but not to be understood, was a special kind of hell. Brenda Vance and her camera had not seen him. They had seen a story, a caricature of a broken veteran, a cliché to be sold between commercials for laundry detergent and pickup trucks. They had taken the one sacred thing he had left, his song for his son, and had broadcast its desecration to the world. He felt the rough texture of the brick against his back, a solid, unforgiving reality. For 10 years, he had survived. He had endured the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. He had held on to the slim, foolish hope that one day, his son might find him. He had pictured the reunion 1,000 times. In his dreams, Ethan would be a young man, but he would have Carol's kind eyes. He would see his father, and there would be a moment of recognition, a flicker of the love that had once bound them. There might be anger, yes, and confusion, But underneath it all, there would be a connection, a thread that not even time and tragedy could break. Now, that dream was poisoned. If Ethan ever saw him, it would be because of a viral video. He would see his father not as a man, but as a spectacle. The piano man. The pity of millions. The thought was unbearable. It was better to be forgotten than to be remembered like this. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the wad of bills people had left him. It was more money than he had held in his hands in years. He stared at it. It felt dirty, tainted. It was payment for his humiliation. He could use it to buy a bus ticket to anywhere. He could be in another city by morning, find another corner, another alley. He could disappear again. The thought was tempting. It was the coward's way out, the path he had taken after Carol died. Running was what he was good at. But as he sat there in the darkness, a different feeling began to stir beneath the despair. It was a faint, unfamiliar flicker of anger. Not the helpless, self-loathing anger he was used to, but a different kind. A clean, hot rage. He was angry at Brenda Vance for her callous ambition. He was angry at the world for its shallow, fleeting curiosity. But most of all, he was angry at himself. He had let them define him. He had let them turn him into a victim. He was Sergeant Michael Sullivan. He had faced down death. He had led men. He had once been a man of courage and conviction. Where was that man now? He slowly, deliberately, straightened his back. The movement was stiff, painful. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, not just from the streets, but from a life of hard work and service. These were the hands that had held his son, that had comforted his wife, that had defended his country. They were not the hands of a ghost. He wouldn't run. Not this time. He didn't know what he would do, but he would not let them chase him away. This corner, this piano, was his. It was the last piece of ground he had in the world, and he would not surrender it. He would play his song, not for the cameras or the crowds, but for the reason he had always played it, for Ethan. It was an act of faith, a blind, desperate prayer sent out into the void. It was all he had left. He would hold his ground. 200 miles away, Ethan was driving. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel of his old pickup truck. He had thrown a bag with a change of clothes in the passenger seat, filled the tank with gas, and just started driving toward the city from the news report. He hadn't called his aunt. He hadn't called in sick to work. He had just left. A single, powerful instinct was guiding him. He had to see him. His mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, a hot coal in his chest. Why had his father left him? Why hadn't he tried to come back? How could he let himself end up like this? But underneath the anger was a deep, aching sadness. He saw the face in the video, the profound loneliness in his father's eyes, and the little boy in him who had missed his dad for 2 decades wanted to cry. He remembered his mother, Carol, only in flashes. Her warm smile, the scent of her perfume, the sound of her laughter. His aunt had told him stories, shown him pictures. He knew that his parents had been deeply in love. He knew that his father had been a good man before the grief broke him. The war didn't break him, his aunt had once said, her voice sad. But losing your mother did. He just shattered. Shattered. That was the word. The man in the video looked shattered. Not just homeless, but utterly broken from the inside out. Ethan pressed his foot down on the accelerator. The city lights began to appear on the horizon, a vast, indifferent glow against the dark sky. He had no plan. He didn't know what he would say, what he would do. He just knew he had to go to that corner. He had to stand in front of the man who was his father and see for himself what was left. Back at the daily grind, Jessica was cleaning up, her movements mechanical. She had seen the whole ugly confrontation with the news crew. She had watched Michael walk away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Her heart ached for him. She felt a surge of anger at the reporter, Brenda Vance, who was now standing under a streetlight with her cameraman, recording a wrap-up segment, her face a mask of professional sympathy. And so the mystery of the piano man continues, Brenda said into the camera. A decorated war hero, lost to the streets, playing a song of love and loss. A man who, tonight, was once again overwhelmed by the world's attention and has vanished back into the shadows. For Channel 8 News, I'm Brenda Vance. Jessica wanted to go out there and scream at her, but she knew it would do no good. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She poured a fresh coffee into a cup, grabbed the last sandwich from the display case, and put on her coat. She didn't know where Michael had gone, but she walked to the entrance of the alley he had disappeared into. "Mike," she called out softly, her voice tentative. "It's Jessica. I have some coffee for you." There was no answer. The alley was dark and silent. "I'm just going to leave it here for you," she said, her voice a little louder. She placed the bag and the cup on a cleanish-looking spot on the ground, just inside the alley's entrance. "I'm so sorry about what happened. People can be awful." She waited for a moment, hoping for a sign, a sound. There was nothing. With a heavy sigh, she turned and went back to her cafe, leaving the small offering of warmth and kindness in the cold darkness. From deep within the alley, Michael had heard her. He had seen the silhouette of her figure against the streetlights. He had heard her kind, worried voice. Her simple, decent act was a stark contrast to the ugliness he had just experienced. It was a lifeline. It was a reminder that not everyone in the world was like Brenda Vance. Some people still saw him. After she was gone, he slowly made his way to the mouth of the alley and picked up the bag and the cup. The coffee was still hot. He held it in his hands, a small anchor in a raging sea. He didn't go back to the piano. Not yet. He retreated back into the shadows to gather what was left of his strength. The night wore on. The city's pulse began to slow. The traffic thinned, the crowds dispersed. Brenda Vance and her news van were long gone, off to edit their story for the morning news. The corner grew quiet. The piano sat under the streetlight, silent and waiting. Around midnight, a pickup truck that had seen better days pulled into a parking spot across the street. Ethan turned off the engine, but he didn't get out. He just sat there, staring at the empty piano bench. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had made it. This was the place. But now that he was here, a paralyzing fear took hold. What if his father didn't come back? What if he had already left, scared off by the news crew? What if he did come back and looked at Ethan with blank, unrecognizing eyes? Or worse, what if he looked at him with shame and turned away? He almost put the key back in the ignition. He could just drive home. He could pretend he had never seen the video. He could go back to his quiet, orderly life and leave the shattered man to his shattered existence. It would be easier. It would be safer. Then he thought of the lullaby, the simple, gentle melody that had been the one constant, unbreakable thread connecting him to his past. The song was a message. For 20 years, his father had been sending a message out into the world, a message meant only for him. He couldn't turn his back on that. He owed it to his father, to his mother's memory, and to the little boy who had never understood why his dad had gone away, to see this through. He took a deep breath, opened the truck door, and stepped out into the cold night air. He crossed the street, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the salty pavement. He stood by the piano, running his hand over the chipped, worn wood. It felt real, solid. He looked around at the empty street, the dark windows of the buildings. He was alone. He waited. 1 hour passed, then another. The cold began to seep into his bones, a deep, relentless chill. A few times, he thought he saw a figure moving in the shadows of the alley, but it was just the wind playing tricks with old newspapers. Doubt began to creep back in. He was an idiot. This was a wild goose chase. He was about to give up, to retreat to the warmth of his truck, when he saw him. A figure emerged from the alley across the street. He moved slowly, hesitantly, like a man testing the ice on a frozen lake. He stayed in the shadows at first, his gaze fixed on the piano. It was him. Older, gaunter, more beaten down than in the video, but it was him. Michael saw the truck, saw the solitary figure of the young man standing by his piano. His first instinct was to retreat. It was another reporter, another curiosity seeker. But this one was different. He wasn't holding a camera or a microphone. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, watching. Michael's heart began to beat a little faster. There was something in the way the young man stood, a familiar set to his shoulders. He took a cautious step out of the shadows, into the light of the street lamp. He still couldn't see the man's face clearly. It was turned away from him, looking down at the piano keys. Slowly, Michael crossed the street. He didn't know why. Every instinct for self-preservation told him to turn and run. But he kept walking, drawn forward by an invisible force. He stopped a few feet away from the piano, his breath held tight in his chest. The young man seemed to sense him. He turned his head slowly. His face was young, but his eyes held an old, familiar sorrow. They were kind eyes. They were Carol's eyes. Time seemed to stop. The city noise faded away to a distant hum. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, two strangers separated by 20 years of silence and pain, staring at each other across a gulf that seemed impossible to cross. Michael's mind struggled to accept what his eyes were seeing. It couldn't be. It was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair. This was a dream, but the young man was real, and the look in his eyes was a mixture of so many things: anger, confusion, hurt. But underneath it all, there was a flicker of something else, a flicker of recognition. That night, the night he had finally given up all hope, the night he was ready to surrender his last patch of ground. He finished the song in his heart and lowered his head, unable to bear the intensity of the young man's gaze. He had played for a ghost, and now the ghost was here. Then a voice broke through the silence. It was quiet, hesitant, and rough with unshed tears. "Dad?" The word struck Michael with the force of a physical blow. It was the name he had longed to hear for 2 decades, the name he thought he would never hear again. He looked up, and the wall he had built around his heart for 20 years crumbled into dust. The tears that had refused to fall in the alley now came in a hot, unstoppable flood. They streamed down his face, into his beard, washing away the years of grime and grief. He turned, his whole body trembling, as his son, the boy he'd been playing for all these years, finally stood before him. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, then another, closing the small gap between them. He reached out a hand, not to touch his father, but just to hold it in the space between them, as if proving to himself that the man was real, solid, and not some apparition conjured by grief and a grainy online video. "I saw a video," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "A friend sent it to me. The song." I remembered the song. Michael could only nod, the tears still tracking paths through the grime on his cheeks. He wiped at his face with the back of his sleeve, a gesture of profound shame. To be seen like this, by the son he had dreamed of for 20 years. Dirty, broken, reeking of the streets. It was a humiliation that cut deeper than any cold or hunger he had ever known. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "For everything. I'm so sorry." He expected anger, accusations, a litany of his failures. He had rehearsed this scene in his mind 1,000 times, and it always ended with his son walking away in disgust. He deserved it. He had been a coward. He had let his grief consume him and had abandoned the most important person in his life. But Ethan's expression wasn't just angry. It was far more complicated than that. It was a landscape of 2 decades of unanswered questions. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking on the single word. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea to understand. "Why did you just disappear? We thought you were dead. I thought you were dead." Michael looked away, his gaze falling to the cracked pavement. How could he explain the suffocating fog of depression that had enveloped him after Carol's death? How could he describe the shame that had paralyzed him, that had made it impossible to even pick up a phone? He had told himself he was protecting Ethan from the wreck he had become, but he knew, deep down, that he was just protecting himself from the judgment in his son's eyes. "After your mother died," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper, "a part of me died with her. The best part. I looked at you, and I saw her. And it was too much. I wasn't strong enough, son. I fell apart. And I was so ashamed. I thought you were better off without me. That was the lie I told myself, every day, for 20 years. He finally met Ethan's gaze again, his own eyes pleading for a scrap of understanding. "But I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. This piano, this song, it was the only way I knew how to talk to you. I just hoped somehow, somewhere you might hear it." Ethan looked from his father's ravaged face to the worn-out piano, and something in his own heart, a hard knot of anger he had carried for most of his life, began to dissolve. He wasn't looking at a monster who had abandoned him. He was looking at a man who had been shattered by a love so great he couldn't survive its loss. A man who had clung to a single memory, a single song, as his only penance and his only connection. He saw the thin, frayed army jacket and thought of the stories his aunt had told him, of the medals his father kept in a box in the attic. This man had faced down enemies for his country, but had been defeated by an enemy within himself. It wasn't an excuse. It didn't erase the years of absence. But for the first time, it was a reason. Across the street, the light in the daily grind flicked on. Jessica had been watching from her darkened window. She had seen the truck arrive. She had seen the young man waiting. She had seen Michael emerge from the shadows. She had held her breath, watching the silent, heart-wrenching drama unfold. When she saw Michael's shoulders begin to shake with sobs, she knew she couldn't just stand by. She unlocked her door and crossed the street, not with the intention to intrude, but with the quiet purpose of a friend. She approached them slowly, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I thought you both could use this," she said softly. Michael looked up, his face a mess of tears and relief. "Jessica, I'm Ethan," his son said, turning to her. He took the cup she offered, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you. I'm Jessica," she replied, giving him a small, compassionate smile. "Your dad, he's a good man. He's just had a hard road." They stood there for a moment in a strange, impromptu circle of warmth on the cold sidewalk. The 2 men, father and son, separated by a lifetime of pain, and the kind woman who had seen a person where everyone else had seen a problem. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, looking at his father. Michael had no answer. He had never allowed himself to think beyond this moment. The reunion itself had been the impossible dream. He had no home to offer, no clean clothes, nothing but the dirty jacket on his back and a heart full of regrets. "You're coming with me," Ethan said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You're not spending another night out here." Michael opened his mouth to protest, the old instincts of shame and unworthiness rising up. But he looked into his son's eyes, his wife's eyes, and saw not pity, but a stubborn, determined love. It was a second chance he knew he didn't deserve, but it was one he was too tired and too broken to refuse. He simply nodded, a wave of exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude washing over him. He turned to the piano one last time. He ran his hand over the keys, a silent farewell to the only friend he had had for a decade. It had been his anchor, his confessional, his beacon. It had saved his life, and now it had delivered his son back to him. Then he looked at Jessica. "Thank you," he said, and the 2 simple words were filled with a universe of meaning. "Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for the kindness. Thank you for seeing me." She just smiled, her eyes shining. "Go on," she whispered. "Go get warm." Ethan put a hand on his father's shoulder. It was the first time they had touched in 20 years. Michael flinched almost imperceptibly at the contact, but he didn't pull away. Together, they turned their backs on the empty corner and the silent piano. They crossed the street and got into the old pickup truck. As Ethan started the engine, Michael looked out the passenger window one last time. He saw Jessica standing on the sidewalk, a small, solitary figure of light in the vast darkness of the city. Then the truck pulled away from the curb and drove off into the coming dawn, leaving the lonely corner behind for good. The story of the piano man didn't end there. The internet moved on, as it always does, to the next fleeting sensation. Brenda Vance's news story aired to high ratings, but was forgotten by the next day. But for Michael and Ethan, the story was just beginning. The drive to Ethan's apartment was saturated with a silence heavier than any city noise. Michael stared out the passenger window, acutely aware of the grime on his skin and the sour smell of the streets that clung to his clothes. He tried to make himself smaller, to press against the door, as if he could contain his own squalor and not contaminate the clean space of his son's truck. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his mind a furnace of emotions. The man beside him was a stranger, a ghost who smelled of alleyways. He wanted to rage about the 2 decades of life moments that had passed without a father, but when he looked over and saw the deep, settled shame in his father's eyes, the anger would recede, replaced by a profound, aching pity. What could he possibly say that would be worse than what this man had already done to himself? They arrived at a modest apartment building in a quiet, working-class neighborhood, a world away from the harshness of downtown. The journey up the stairs was a trial for Michael, his legs aching in protest. Ethan unlocked the door to his small, immaculately clean apartment. To Michael, who had spent 10 years sleeping on concrete, it looked like a palace. The air was warm and smelled of sawdust and coffee. It smelled like a home. "The bathroom's down the hall," Ethan said, his voice unnaturally loud. "There are clean towels. You can take a shower. I'll find you some clothes." The simple offer felt like an act of transcendent grace. In the bathroom, Michael looked in the mirror for the first time in years. The face that stared back was a stranger's, a hollow-eyed creature with a wild beard and the haunted look of a shipwreck survivor. He stood under the hot water for a long time, letting it wash away not just the dirt, but the deep grime on his soul. When he emerged, he found a set of clean clothes laid out in the spare room, a soft flannel shirt and worn-in jeans. They were Ethan's, and a little too big, but they were the most comfortable things he had ever worn. Dressed in his son's clothes, he felt a flicker of dignity. He found Ethan in the kitchen making sandwiches. The silence between them stretched on. Ethan placed a plate and a glass of milk on the small kitchen table. Michael sat down and ate with a slow, deliberate reverence. It wasn't just food. It was a meal prepared for him by his son. Finally, Ethan sat across from him. "I have so many questions," he said, his voice low. "I know," Michael replied, his gaze fixed on his plate. "I'll answer them. All of them." And so, they began to talk. The conversation was halting, punctuated by long, difficult silences. Ethan asked about his mother, the war, the years after she died. Michael answered as best he could, his voice often breaking. He didn't make excuses. He laid his failures bare, confessing his weakness, his cowardice, his profound, paralyzing grief. He told Ethan about the shelters, the hunger, and the cold. And he told him about the piano, about how playing that lullaby every night was the only thing that kept him tethered to the world, the only thing that kept the memory of his wife and son alive in his broken heart. Ethan listened, his expression unreadable. Forgiveness didn't come immediately. The wounds were too deep. But as the sun began to rise, a fragile bridge of understanding began to form. Ethan started to see the man behind the ghost, the father behind the failure. He saw a man who had been broken by love and who had never, not for a single day, stopped loving him. The road back was not easy. There were years of pain to unpack, decades of silence to fill. Michael had to face the demons of addiction and trauma, a process that was slow and fraught with setbacks. Ethan had to grapple with his own anger, learning to forgive a man who was only just learning how to forgive himself. But for the first time, they were not alone. Ethan took his father to doctors and support groups. He taught him how to live in a house again, how to sleep in a bed without fear. Michael, in turn, began to slowly re-engage with the world. He shared stories of Ethan as a baby, small, precious moments his son had forgotten. He was a father again, and in becoming one, he started to become himself again. He had a home, a warm bed, and a future he never thought he would see. Some months later, a package arrived at the Daily Grind. Inside was a small, beautifully crafted wooden model of the public piano and a simple, handwritten note. "Jessica," it read, "thank you for the coffee. It saved my life in more ways than you'll ever know. I am finally home. Your friend, Michael Sullivan." And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.